How's it going, everybody? This podcast is brought to you by Rise Make Life Workout, a health, self-development and lifestyle platform building a passionate community of knowledge seekers, creative dreamers and future leaders.
For details on the latest Rise event that will feature expert speakers in the field of self-development and growth, check out www.rise-workout.com.
That's www.rise-workout.com. Enjoy the show.
Hello and welcome back to Rise Optimize, where we make science simple to help optimize your health. My name's Sinead Bierman and today I'm joined again by Dr. Char. Hi, Dr. Char.
Hello.
And today we are going to dive deep into fitness and activity trackers. Really cool topic that I'm excited to explore today with you, Dr. Char.
Yeah, I'm really excited too. I love this type of stuff. So yeah, let's get into it.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's start with maybe what are we talking about when we say fitness trackers? What sort of classifies as a fitness tracker?
Yeah, so I think what will be best for us to talk about here that qualifies as a fitness tracker is basically a wearable device that measures some aspect of your physiology. And I think for most people nowadays that comes in the form of like a wristwatch that has all of the sensors in it that give you feedback about things like your heart rate or your steps and energy expenditure, things like that. There are also some of those which have things like a chest strap as well. That's sort of like another component of a fitness tracker. But yeah, for the most part, I would say like a watch with some type of screen or interface that you can connect to and look at, and it gives you feedback on your physiology or your activity while you're doing it. I think that sort of
covers what it is.
Sound right to you?
Yep. And so a couple of the things that they measure, I guess, in general would be heart rate, our step count, our energy expenditure. Are there any other main things that are covered by most trackers?
Yeah, now you're starting to see more sleep monitoring type functions in fitness watches or activity trackers as well. There are a couple that you'll see, they give you things like real fancy ones, give you different skin temperatures or what your blood oxygenation level is. But yeah, for the majority of them across the market will be heart rate, step count, energy expenditure, and sleep. Yeah.
Awesome. So today we'll focus on, in particular, heart rate, energy expenditure, and sleep as they're the most common. And we'll touch on, I guess, how accurate these devices are at actually measuring all those things.
Yeah, this part's quite interesting. I guess we can start with the main ways that those watches actually get those measures, like what the sensors are. So heart rate is measured by something called a photoplethysmograph. And on those wristwatches where you're getting a heart rate just from the wristwatch, it's basically the little flickering lights that are on the back of your watch. And they measure changes in blood volume across the blood vessels just underneath the skin surface at your wrist. And using that waveform that they collect from that, they then estimate heart rate that way. So you've got that's measuring your heart rate. Then also in those watches, they usually have what's called an accelerometer, and that essentially measures movement through space. So as you're moving your hand while you're wearing the watch, it will be recording that, and that they use that to try and sometimes they use it to try and detect what type of activity you're doing, but they also use it as a way of also feeding into that energy expenditure measurement. And then sleep is measured mostly by the accelerometer as well. So for different activities that your watch is giving you feedback on, or like for that total energy expenditure measurement that you might be getting at the end of the day from your watch, when you do an activity and you select what type of activity, some of the watches will kind of cater what sensory information they're inputting into that actual calculation, depending on what the activity is and what other sensors might be available to you. So for example, like if you're doing a cardiovascular type activity like running or cycling, then heart rate probably goes into that calculation of energy expenditure in addition to the accelerometer data as well. But your general day-to-day wear energy expenditure is mostly coming from the accelerometer data. on the wrist.
That's quite interesting. I've always wondered that when heart rate monitors I've had in the past have said, what activity are you doing? Are you doing a group fitness class, or are you going for a run, or are you going for some, if you can wear them in the water, are you swimming, and asked you what activity you're doing? And I did wonder how that, I guess, differs the way it would measure what I was doing.
Yeah, well, most of those energy expenditure calculations actually come from the relationship between power and energy expenditure during activity. So an guesstimation of what power might be for like during a cardiovascular activity, like heart rate is quite a good approximation for that. But for other sort of more complex movements, it may not be. So yeah, they kind of combine the inputs in some cases, depending on what the activity is. In saying that, though, you never have full transparency on how exactly each of these devices are calculating all of the things, because they're obviously covered as the IP of or intellectual property of the company. And so you're not always able to interrogate like whether one watch is likely to be more accurate than another based on the way that they calculate those things, because you can't see exactly how they're doing it. The main way that we've been able to look at whether or not a device is accurate is by comparing the performance of a watch, say, against what we would call a criterion measure, or like the most sort of gold standard measure that we can get in the laboratory, and then look at how well it's estimating based on that. So things like energy expenditure, is it underestimating or overestimating compared to the actual gold standard measure that we normally would use in the laboratory? And so we benchmark it against that.
Yeah. Specifically in regards to heart rate, I guess, and sensing heart rate, is there much of a difference between the heart rate that's picked up from your wristwatch versus wearing a chest strap?
There can be a little bit more error in the wristwatch one, but it's actually pretty good, really. So it's about within 10 beats per minute of what would be the most accurate heart rate, like a gold standard measure of heart rate, which is pretty good. Sometimes there's a bit of a latency when you start activity until you start to see an accurate heart rate. There are a couple of things that introduce a bit of noise or a bit of error into the measure as well, so that will affect things. But for example, if you're just doing cycling exercise, you're wearing the device correctly, then you can bank on it being a pretty accurate measure of your heart rate, especially because one of the things that would introduce error is moving around the watch a lot, because that can move the device and the lights that are detecting the stimulus that they need to detect. And so that can start to introduce error into your heart rate measure as a result. So doing something like body combat, for example, where you're like throwing your arms around heaps, that's probably going to introduce maybe a bit of error potentially in that measure. But generally, it's actually pretty good.
Yeah. And I guess maybe if you've got the watch maybe too tight or too loose, I guess that would cause more movement if it was quite loose as well and not getting as a good contact.
Yeah, exactly. Basically, it's just because the lights are emitting underneath the skin surface, the more distance you increase between it, the greater the likelihood that you have for error. So if you're wearing your watch way too loose, then that's going to introduce error. But then in the same token, if it's way too tight, then you're compressing the tissues around the wrist and introducing error in that way as well. So just follow the device instructions on how to wear it, and that will hopefully reduce it. One thing actually that I only sort of started reading into after I was talking to a friend about it is darker skin as well. Sometimes with certain devices they seem to not pick up heart rate as well, which is kind of interesting. It's because of the type of light that they use. It's not as effective at penetrating past the skin surface on darker skin.
I guess moving on to energy expenditure in regards to the accuracy of measuring that through the wristwatch and things like that. Does that come down more to the accuracy of data you're putting in, or is it the accuracy of how the device actually measures how much energy we're expending?
Yeah, so with that, they're actually using, I've sort of alluded to it before, they're using kind of indirect way of calculating energy expenditure because they don't have access to a much more direct method of doing that like you would in a lab. So they're combining input from the accelerometer data, potentially the heart rate data if you're selecting certain activities as well, or if, for example, you can connect your watch to like a power meter on one of the exercise bikes or exercise machines that you're working on, that's probably in most cases also going to be fed into that measure for the energy expenditure of a given activity. But they're also using the data that you input, like, when you make your profile for the watch. So things like your age, weight, height, gender, those also go into that calculation as well. So it's important that those things are accurate, but I think it's also good to note that they're using quite general characteristics there. So one of the things that's particularly important for energy expenditure is how much sort of metabolically active mass you have. So how much muscle mass you might have. That's not necessarily reflected in the measure that you're getting from your watch. And even if someone of the same age, gender, and height as you, your body compositions can still be very different. And so while they are combining a bunch of information there are those sort of small potentials for error to be introduced in that way, because essentially they're using a calculation to estimate your energy expenditure, and that relies on a couple of assumptions around your body characteristics that are very general.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So sort of around someone's like what their metabolic rate might be and things like that we can't obviously input that data into the tracker. Yeah,
exactly. And some devices allow you to input even more detailed data. If you've had fitness testing done and you get your heart rate zones, like your anaerobic threshold, the heart rate that appears at, for example, some devices will allow you to do that. And that's a way of kind of improving the accuracy of some of the measures that they might give you. But yeah, in general, they're basing it on some of those population characteristics, I suppose. Yeah.
And so based on that, what's sort of the window of error? Like you said before, with heart rate, it's roughly within 10 beats per minute. What is it like with energy expenditure?
Yeah, it varies so much from device to device just because of the different ways that they all try to minimize error, essentially. And you can't necessarily see how they do that, but it seems like it can go from anywhere from at minimum around 20% to up to 40%. So that's pretty huge, the up to 40% type of error in that. And that number comes from a study where they looked just at the energy expenditure of activities like walking, running, and cycling. So to see that sort of degree of error in those activities, and like we don't even know what it looks like for more complex activities. There are studies that look at sort of total energy expenditure across the day type of thing as well. But yeah, there's still a degree of error in them. So best case, probably you can expect about 20%.
Yeah. So if you're someone, I've seen this before in cycle classes, that someone that people that will stay on the bike after the class is finished and they're like, oh, I'm at 495 calories. I just want to get to 500, so I'm just going to keep cycling and get those last 5 calories. You probably already have them, maybe, or you might even be actually 200 calories off that. So I think that's why I'm not a big fan of focusing on the calories. I think, like you said, heart rate and things like that, but yeah, calories, I think. You're moving, that's the main thing.
Yeah, it seems like when you average the error overall, it does seem like the watches for particular activities do seem to underestimate energy expenditure. But in saying that what they call the error bars, so that margin of error around that average is huge, and it varies between the devices quite a lot. So it really depends on the type of device that you're using and stuff. I mean, great if it's allowing people to get a goal to get more active or something along those lines. But yeah, I guess the point really to emphasize here is to not get too obsessed with the actual number and hang your hat on it and be like, that's definitely what I burned today, because it's probably not.
And then I guess lastly to touch on would be the accuracy of these devices in measuring sleep. I've read a bit about this. And I think it's similar to what we've touched on before, but what's your, experience in checking the data in regards to sleep?
Well, I think you've probably done more reading into this than I have, but the general patterns I saw and what I read was that the devices are pretty good at looking at sleep duration, and the devices I'm sort of meaning the ones that come to mind, like the really common devices like an Apple Watch, or I think Garmin do sleep as well, and I know that my Sunto one does. There's so many others, but like most people are going to think of an Apple Watch when they think of a smartwatch usually, or like a Fitbit, for example. They're pretty good at figuring out about the time that you fell asleep and when you actually got up again. So they get a good marker of sleep duration. Some of them are now trying to do the different stages of sleep, but it seems like compared to the gold standard measure that they take in the lab, they do it pretty poorly. And sometimes they actually change the way that they've sort of made up their own sleep phases and explain it to people, and so it can be a little bit confusing to interpret.
I've read similar in that in regards to being able to tell you when you're awake and when you're asleep, it's relatively accurate, but in regards to stages of sleep, REM sleep and non-REM sleep, it's okay. And then even the deeper stages of sleep, so knowing light and deep between non-REM, that it's not, again, compared to being in a sleep lab, it's definitely not there, but that it can be used, I guess, more so to see patterns over time. So like I said, you shouldn't really be looking at it for day-to-day data, but trends over time is really what could give you more of an idea about what you might need to be focusing on. Or it said little things like alcohol or jet lag, things that we know do affect sleep, that you might be able to see that. And if there is a huge change in what your sleep data's telling you, that you could think, oh yeah, that's because I had a few drinks last night, or that's because I've traveled, or my room was really warm last night, or I had a big meal right before I went to sleep. Those things will likely show some sort of change in the data.
Have you ever looked at your sleep data in much depth?
Not really. A few years ago, I had a Fitbit and that tracked your sleep. And I remember like every morning, some mornings I'd wake up and I think, oh, I had the best sleep last night. Like I felt like I didn't move. And then I'd check my Fitbit data and it would say, oh, you were inactive all this time, you were tossing and turning. And I thought, oh, that's weird. I felt like I had a good sleep, but it said I didn't. And then on other days, I would wake up in the morning and think, man, I had a shit sleep last night. And then I'd check it and it said like perfect sleep, perfect 8 hours, you didn't move. And that's when I was spending 5 minutes every morning reading through this data. And I thought I can kind of tell and feel if I've had a good night's sleep or not, instead of spending 5 minutes every morning reading through this data that I wasn't feeling was in alignment with what I was feeling. So that's when I was like, oh, this is sort of wasting. That's 5 minutes in the morning I could be spending doing something else. So yeah, I often have trouble with sleeping, and so I was using my watch for a while to kind of and checking in on that data, but I ended up just getting more stressed out because it was saying that my total sleep duration was like 4 hours, and then you sort of like see that, you're like, oh god, I'm not too stoked about that, so I sort of stopped using it actually, just because for me it was better to go by how I was feeling for that in particular, but each to their own, you know. Yeah, I think it's like you've said before, it's one of those things that you shouldn't really get hung up on the data. Same with, like you said, energy expenditure. If at the end of the day, how many calories you burn ends up dictating what workout you do and how much you're exercising, it's probably not a great thing. And then same with the sleep data, if you're sort of letting that dictate everything you do versus just using it as a guide and just sort of looking at the patterns over time versus getting too hung up on the day-to-day figures.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, this is one point that I didn't make earlier, but it just based on what you were saying, it's a good one to make, like in seeing patterns over time. So while these devices are potentially erroneous in some of the information that they're giving back out to us just because of the type of assumptions they have to make about in their calculations and things, they often are reliably wrong. So the amount of error that they're introducing will be pretty similar between like day to day, which makes it useful for like what you were saying before in terms of looking at general patterns over time. It may not be that the actual number is exactly correct in what you would get in a lab, but it's off by about the same amount.
Yeah, it's going to be consistently wrong.
Yeah. So and there's utility in that as well. Yeah. Are there
any other sort of big tips for people on how they should get the most out of the information? Like we've obviously touched on there, not getting too hung up on the day-to-day numbers and looking for patterns, but are there any other things they should really keep in mind to get the most out of their device and the information it gives them?
Yeah, I think we've touched on a couple of them. So things like just keeping your personal profile, so the little user input things that they ask, keeping that up to date. If there is an option for, so say you've had some type of like aerobic fitness testing done, and the person that you've talked to has given you your like heart rate zones, or basically the relationship between your power output and then your heart rate through exercise, and then where you maxed out, you can figure out your heart rate zones from that, and that can be useful to input into your watch. I know that some of the more kind of cardio focused watches, or like I guess more intense like fitness sports watches, have that option. So things like Garmin and Sunto have that option in them. I'm not sure about some of the other ones, but yeah, keeping those personal attributes up to date is quite important. Making sure that you're wearing it properly as well, just because if your main heart rate measure is coming from your wrist, given that you're not getting any type of input from like a chest strap or anything, make sure that like you read the instructions on how to fasten it to your wrist, right? I know some people have like that I've talked to have been like, oh man, it's not picking up my heart rate properly. And they'll like, do it really super tight. And you're like, no, that's not probably going to help either. It's partly like placement and just getting sort of the right thing. So play around with that. But the best guide is to just read the instructions on the actual watch manufacturer, because they'll have tested that. Yeah, I think those sort of the major tips, I suppose. There's all types of ways that you can use the data that you're getting from these watches. I think I've spoken about this example before, but one way for that I think some people don't always think about in terms of trying to track their fitness using the data from their watches, to set themselves at like a constant power output on a bike, for example, or even running like the same speed and incline, and looking at, if you have a workout that you do where that's sort of regular, you set those things, you can look over time to see how your heart rate responds once you've been going at for a couple of minutes at that type of intensity or power output. And, a device like a watch that's pretty accurate within 10 beats, best case scenario, like pretty much within 2 beats per minute, it will give you a really good indication. If your heart rate is lower at the same intensity, then you can kind of say, wow, maybe I got fitter over time and adapted to this training. That's sort of one way to actually use that heart rate data in a little bit more detail than just looking at like your average and max over the period of a workout. Yeah, there are heaps of possibilities with this stuff, and it really just depends on how you use that information.
Yeah, that's what I use my heart rate monitor for, is those kind of things. Like if I run the same loop and I'm sort of looking at what my pace was and what my heart rate was and thinking, oh, last time I did that run at same speed, my heart rate was a lot higher and it's less now, so therefore I'm likely getting fitter. Yeah, versus how many calories I've burned or what was my max heart rate. But yeah, like you said, I guess people interpret the data differently, but I do think it's worthwhile if you are going to be using that data to look into it and yeah, like you said, get the most out of it. If you are going to be, spending time each day to interpret your data, I think understanding what you're interpreting and using it to the best of your ability would be my recommendation too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, you can get so technical with it, but yeah, I think for most gym goers, sort of having a few things up their sleeve, like what you were saying before, how to identify those general patterns is sort of the most important thing. Not getting too worried about overall energy expenditure. They can be a really great behavioral tool. Like if you're trying to increase your activity level generally, they can be a really motivating tool to use in sort of setting like step count goals or something along those lines. But yeah, just refrain from getting too obsessed with the actual number necessarily, and coming back to some of those more subjective things around how you're feeling after the exercise and stuff like that as well, and putting that into your overall judgment on how you're doing with your fitness is I think really important.
Definitely. Yeah, I think there's some very informed takeouts in there for a lot of people today. If they've got any more questions, where can they find you, Dr. Char?
You can find me on Instagram. My handle is Charlie J. Connell.
Awesome. We'll add the references and a few links into the show notes as well if people want to check out those papers and things. So yeah, I think there's
quite a lot of them. If anyone has trouble accessing them because they're behind a paywall, they can get in touch with me and I'll get them a copy of it. But yeah.
Awesome. Sweet. Well, thanks for your time again, Dr. Char. I'm sure we'll be back with more.
Yeah, looking forward to it.